Genesis 22. And it came to pass after these things that God did prove Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Where am? Here I am. No, let me read this again. And it came to pass after these things that God did prove Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest, even Isaac, and get thee into the land of Moron, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took two of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he cleaved the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up, and went unto the place of which God had told him. On the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder, and we will worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid up upon Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and he went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said unto my father, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together, and they came to the place which God hath told him of. And Abraham built the altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angels of Jehovah called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horn. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, In the mount of Jehovah it shall be provided. And the angels of Jehovah called unto Abraham a second time out of heaven, and said, By myself have I sworn, saith Jehovah, because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessings I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thee seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt as Beersheba. And it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah, she also hath borneth children unto thy brother Nahor, Uz his firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Camul the father of Aram, and Chelist, and Hazo, and Pildash, and Jiplad, and Bethu. And Bethu begat Rebekah. These 8 did Milcah bear to Nahor, Abraham's brother, and his concubine, whose name was Rima. She also bare Teba, and Ganham, and Tahash, and Makkah. Genesis 22 is a climatic faith chapter in Abraham's story, but it's not mainly about God liking extreme sacrifice. It's about who God is, what kind of faith God forms, and how the covenant promise will move forward without becoming a human-made idol. It also becomes one of the Bible's deepest foundation for substitution in the stead of his son, and for the idea that God himself will provide what he requires. I walk it in layers. God did prove Abraham. This is a test, not God endorsing child sacrifice. Genesis 22, verse 1 through 2. The narrative tells you up front. This is proving, testing in the ancient Near East. Child sacrifice exists in some cultures. Genesis 22 functions as a decision revelation. The truth, God will not ultimately accept the death of the covenant child, yet God commands is intentionally wrenching. Thy son, thy only son, whom thou lovest. This is covenant language aimed at Abraham's deepest attachment. God is pressing a question. Do you love the giver about the gift? Isaac is the promise embodied. Abraham could easily turn Isaac into an idol, the guarantee that replaces trust in God. What God is saying, my promise is real, but you must not treat the promise as your God. I am God, not my gifts. Abraham's obedience is immediate and silent. Faith sometimes walks without emotional narration. Genesis 22, verse 3 to 6. Abraham rose early. The text is sparse and heavy. It shows obedience without dramatics. That's not because Abraham feels nothing. It's because the story is focusing on the weight of trust. Faith that acts when understanding is limited. Then the image. Isaac carries the wood. That deliberate, the promised son carries the instrument of his own offering. The narrative is building a pattern the Bible will echo later. The beloved son moving towards sacrifice. What God is saying, faith is not control. It is obedience in the dark. Walking forward with what you have. Trust in me with what you can't see. We will worship and come again. Abraham's statement reveals resurrection level trust. Genesis 22, verse 5. I and the lad will go, and we will worship and come again. Abraham speaks as if Isaac will return. How? Because God's covenant promise is tied to Isaac. Abraham is trapped between God's command, offers Isaac, God's promise through Isaac, the seed comes. So Abraham's faith is not generic optimism, it's covenant logic. God must be faithful even if I can't imagine how. This is why later biblical reflection reads this as faith that God could even raise the dead. The text itself doesn't say resurrection, but it shows Abraham trusting God beyond visible possibility. What God is saying, my promise is so sure that you can obey me without needing to see the mechanism of fulfillment. Where is the lamb? God will provide the center line of the chapter. Genesis 22, verse 7 through 8. Isaac asked the most human question in the story. Where is the lamb? Abraham answers, God will provide himself the lamb. This is the theological axis of Genesis 22. God is the one who provides what he demands. The future of the covenant is not secured by Abraham's capacity to pay, but God's provision. What God is saying, the true solution to sin, sacrifice, and covenant fulfillment will come from me, not from your manipulations or loss. The binding and the knife, faith reaches the point of surrender. Genesis 22, verse 9 through 10. Abraham binds Isaac and lifts the knife. The text forces you to feel the extremity because it wants you to grasp what fear of God means here. Not terror, but ultimate alliance. God above all. This is not celebrating trauma. It's exposing the deepest human tendency to hold our future, our legacy, our Isaac as untouchable. God tests whether Abraham's trust is real. What God is saying, nothing, not even the things you call the promise, can be held above me. Lay not thy hand. God stops the sacrifice and reveals the point. Genesis 22, verse 11 through 12. Lay not thy hand upon the lad. Now I know that thou fearest God. God is not learning information like a human. The test makes known Abraham's faith. Objectively, publicity, covenantally. Abraham trusts because it revealed reality. Most importantly, God forbids the killing. This is a moral boundary maker in in Israel's scripture. Unlike the gods of the nations, Yahweh does not ultimately require child sacrifice. What God is saying, I will not be worshipped like the demons of the nations. I test faith, but I reject child sacrifice. The ram in the stead of his son. Substitution is introduced as God's pattern. Genesis 22, verse 13, a ram offered in the stead of his son. This is the first time the narrative states substitution this explicitly. Isaac lives because a provided sacrifice dies instead. That is not a small detail. It becomes a template. Life sparred by a substitution provision by God, worship through replacement. What God is saying, I will save the promised line by providing a substitution. My salvation works through substitutionary provision. Jehovah Jireh, in the mount it shall be provided. Genesis 22 verse 14. Abraham named the place Uriah. The Lord will provide the Lord will provide, see to it. In Hebrew, see and provide are conceptual linked. God sees the need and sees it and sees to it. The saying, in the mount of Jehovah it shall be provided, means provision is not random. It tied to God chosen place and God's chosen way. The mountain becomes a theological landmark. God provides at the point of impossible obedience. What God is saying, when you reach the end of your control, that's where my provision becomes unmistakable. The oath reaffirmation. God anchors the global blessing promise again. Genesis 22 verse 15 through 18. God swears, by myself have I sworn. That maximal certainty. God has no higher authority to appeal to. Then he repeats the covenant themes. Multiplied seeds, stars/sand, victory, possessed the gates, global blessings, all nations blessed. And he tied it to Abraham's obedience, not as an earning salvation, but as the covenant response that demonstrates faith's reality. What God is saying, the covenant is not weakened by this test. It is confirmed and intensified. Your obedience is the evidence that you truly trust my promise. The genealogic note. Genesis 22 verse 20 through 24. Rebekah is being introduced quietly. The chapter ends with Nahor's child and mentions Rebekah. That's not filler. It's providence. After the near loss of Isaac, the test immediately points towards the future wife through whom the covenant line continues. What God is saying, I am not improvising. Even when the story feels like it could collapse, I have already prepared the next step. The main message of Genesis 22 in one sentence. God tests Abraham to purify covenant faith from idolatry, reveals that he rejects child sacrifice, provides a substitute in the stead of Isaac, and reaffirms with sword certainty that the promise will advance through Abraham's seed to bless all nations, because the covenant ultimately rests in God's provision, not human control. Genesis 22.